Let's talk about identity. And indeed, this is the month of February when we focus on Black history and Black self-identity. Isn't that so? Now, I, Olive Hennings, Black, woman, Jamaican, American, Seventh-day Adventist, minister of the gospel, college professor, sibling, cousin, aunt, grand-aunt, wife, mother. Does this answer the question of my being? This is a reality. This is the thing. I can perfectly live out this identity without ever coming to know who I am. For the most part, we identify ourselves based on the sum total of our experiences. Now, human experience includes gender, sexual orientation, race, class, education, nationality, immigration status, religion, denomination, belief system, memory, and all the ups and downs of our lives, and various other events that may or may not be unique to the individual or the group. All these elements of experience make up what we call the personality. But personality is not who I am. The word personality comes from the Latin persona. Now, the Latin persona actually means mask. So back in the ancient world, when the actors would come on stage, they would put on a persona, a mask. It's merely a mask. It's a mosaic of temporal experience. But personality does not answer the question, who am I? According to the Swiss psychiatrist and psychoanalyst Carl Jung, the privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. Now, Jung is not talking about personality. Neither is he talking about the ego that emerges from personality. The question transcends the ego. Now let's talk about ego. The term ego literally means I. It is actually the Greek personal pronoun ego, epsilon, gamma, omega, E-G, long O. We anglicize the pronunciation and say ego, but the Greek is ego. So the ego is the I, as in self-interest. The ego causes us to see ourselves as separate from others and the things that sustain us. Now, the ego has two major interdependent manifestations. First, there's the individual ego, the individual self-interest. And then there's the collective ego, the group interest. A particular group with a common self-interest is a collective ego. And the individual self is of necessity part of a group or several groups. Any one of you here belong to several groups, not just one group. Your family, your denomination, your race, and so forth. The individual ego, in turn, is vitally hooked to the collective ego. We often identify as collectives: African American, black male, black female, Latinx, or Seventh-day Adventist. These may all function as collective egos because each group has a common identity towards common survival interests. It's for this reason that you have lobbyists. They are vying for the interests of a particular group. Now, when the major preoccupation is the survival of the group, as separate and apart from others, regardless of the interests of others, the group becomes a collective ego. It's a collective ego because it is chiefly defined by its self-interest towards survival of the group. The actions of the collective ego reflect the norms and boundaries that it prescribes and marks off against others. So the collective ego is the most powerful and volatile manifestation of the ego. It can wield absolute power over the individual to the extent that the individual ego cannot grasp the fact that the collective ego cannot survive without it. It's like a great big bully. A very significant example of a collective ego is the faith community. It can be even more brutal than other groups, precisely because it sets itself apart from others as superior in its understanding of God. Generally, this aura of superiority is a matter of survival. This is why those who belong to such groups may come under severe scrutiny on how they conform to the norms, the dogmas, the doctrines, and lifestyle of the group. If I had done an airing this morning, people would be looking and wouldn't hear what I say. And the average member of the group conforms in the interest of his or her survival for fear of losing their livelihood, for fear of being ostracized or stigmatized or even ridiculed. So the collective ego tends to co-opt the individual conscience. Let's take an example. A pastor wants to ordain a woman as head elder of his congregation because he does not see anyone more capable than this sister. But he decides against it. See, as he's on the conference presidency. He wants to be conference president. Election coming up next year. His chauvinistic colleagues may vote him down if they fear that he ordains, because they hear that he ordains a woman as his first elder. What has happened here? The collective ego hijacks his conscience, hijacks his consciousness, because his own self-interest and self-identity is hooked to it. A faith community is not necessarily, does not have to be a collective ego. But when a faith community loses its spiritual direction to nurture individuals towards unity with God, when its focus is on the individual's conformity to the group rather than the individual's relationship with God, when its identity becomes narcissistic, when its focus is on its own survival, it becomes a collective ego. And it's at times brutal and insane. I'll give you an example. There's a point in the history of this country when the collective ego, in the name of Christian values, displayed itself in the splendor of its insanity. It was a case of the Little Rock Nine. Ever heard about the Little Rock Nine? And I had the privilege last year, April, to be in the presence of one of them up at Walla Walla University, where I responded to his speech there. In 1957, Little Rock Central High School in Arkansas had become a test case for racial segregation in America. 9 high-achieving black kids were offered up as the guinea pigs. Now, 3 years earlier, the Supreme Court had ruled that the segregation of schools was unconstitutional. But in the South, where Jim Crow collective ego ruled with a mighty hand, they dragged their feet and refused to bend. On the first day of school, an angry mob came out to intimidate these kids and prevent them from going into the school. By happenstance, On that first day of school, there was only one black student there to face the angry mob. Elizabeth Eckford is her name. They screamed, shouted obscenities, calling for her to be lynched as this girl clutched her folder and walked unflinchingly towards the school. Governor of Arkansas ordered security forces to stop her at the school door, and she was chased away by the mob. The 9 black students finally got into the school later that month, but only after President Eisenhower intervened and sent the 101st Airborne to escort them to school. They had to be escorted to school by security forces. But for an entire year, fellow students punched, spat on, and threw eggs on Elizabeth. Now, Elizabeth is not the only star of that infamous movie scene captured by journalists for the annals of history. Another star in that was a young lady called Hazel Bryan. See that young lady screaming behind her? The hatred on Bryan's face as she screamed at Elizabeth to go back to Africa has gone down in history as a symbol of the evil of Jim Crowism. But to be fair, the girl, the same age as Elizabeth, was only part of a mob with her parents and other parents and community leaders as her mentor. Her own identity was lost in the identity of the group. Her own consciousness was hijacked. In later life, she came into consciousness. She apologized to Elizabeth, and they became lifelong friends. As a mother, I often ask, what parents would be part of this angry mob? What parents? Don't you have children who you want to go to school? And something frightening comes to mind. If the racial line were switched, could I have been one of those antagonists, blindly obeying the insane collective ego? These are questions we all must ask, because this is not a black-white problem. This is a human problem. It comes in many colors. There's something out of joint in time and space, lost in the madness of fear and anxiety over our survival. You know, laws have changed, huh? Laws have changed for the greater good. And this is vital to collective responsibility. Such changes paint the portrait of a world yearning to come of age. But to what extent do laws really change us? These barriers that we erect in the interest of survival, they never really disappear. They only shift. Because you see, the ego, the I, is needy and insatiable. Yesterday, 1957, there was a madness at Little Rock Central High School. Today, 2020, there's the insanity at El Paso border. Children locked in cages at the border, crying for their parents whom they may never see again. Christian institutions in general no longer practice segregation, right? You know, I teach at a university that used to be segregated, you know. So I'm there now. It's not segregated, right? Have we really changed? Or have we really changed our laws and policies here Or have we only changed our laws and policies here, and then we find a different sets of barrier there? We change it here, but then we go over here and we find another set of barriers to feed the insatiable ego. It's insatiable. This church, for example, may be over segregation in the school and in the pew, but it still holds on to segregation in the pulpit. Gender segregation. I have to remind a lot of people who invite me to preach Women's Day that I also preach on other days. We hold on to gender segregation not for biblical or godly reasons. All the studies in our church show that. But in the interest of survival, we hold on to it. We call it unity. This unity is really the insecure collective ego. And so many have bought into this mob mentality rather than trust in God to do what is right. Where is trust? How can the madness end if there's no true transformation? Where is the revival and reformation? Is this revival and reformation slogan about true spirituality, or is it about maintenance of the status quo, the survival of the collective ego?